So I'm really pleased to introduce today's keynote session with Simon, Buckingham, Shum. My name is Dragan Gašić. I'm one of the members of the Society for Quantitative Ethnography. It's really great honor to introduce Simon. Simon is one of the leaders in the field of learning analytics. I go back about 10, 11 years with Simon. We first met in a frozen Banff in Canada in 2011 when we organized the first Learning Analytics conference. And ever since, I had a really great honor to collaborate with Simon. Simon is a really influential leader in the broader field of learning analytics and a very deep thinker about the important issues that are surrounding different aspects of the use of artificial intelligence in education, the use of different data techniques, and more importantly, also the introduction of different human factors that are surrounding issues that are related to technology. Simon had really many excellent contributions before we even started working together or with many other people in the broader field of learning analytics, and more recently also in quantitative ethnography. Notable work Simon did is related to argumentation, and in particular of visualization of argumentation. Also some excellent work on knowledge cartography and the ways how we are interacting with some of these issues. Simon was also one of the founders of a community which emerged in the mid-2000s that was related to pragmatic web and organized an ACM conference on that topic. Simon has been more recently contributing far many interesting contributions related to human-centered learning analytics and the importance of the ways how we can introduce relevant ways to design more effective learning analytics and have different human voices and the factors in the ways how we are looking into different issues. Simon's work also is quite important in the writing analytics and the way how we can support learners in their quest to improve their writing in terms of rhetorical moves as well as their reflective writing. But again, it's always a nice, a nice combination between the way how we visualize that information with the way how we analyze that information. And Simon has been really actively contributing to the field of quantitative ethnography. In recent years, he's been generously coordinating some of the activities related to the webinar series that was run by the Society for Quantitative Ethnography, as well as Simon did really some exciting work on the introduction of quantitative ethnography methods with the use of different multimodal data, and had an important publication presented at the last year conference as well. So without any further ado, Simon, please take your floor.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dragan, for the kind introduction. And it's really a great honor to be given the stage to address you all and share some thoughts with you. And as you can see, I'm going to be talking about QE visualizations as tools for thinking, and I'll be explaining why that's so important to me. The way I want to start is by talking about this amazing bring and share meal that is quantitative ethnography. I think somebody in the fantastic panel yesterday about the future of the community and what it feels like to be entering this community talked about the fact that you don't know who you're going to bump into who's got expertise in a particular domain, who is coming to the QE table. So my goal today is to share some of the dishes that I've been working on and eating for the last 20 years or so, and explain why they excite me, and I hope that that they may go well with something that you bring. Now, here's the overview of the talk then. First, I'll explain how I was reflecting on why have I drawn to QE. And I realized that my academic journey has kind of primed me for many of the ideas in QE. Then I have a confession which I'm going to make, which is that I have been a participant observer of the QE community. As someone who's coming in, I'm by no means expert in QE or ENA. Most of you know more about using the tools and conducting some of that analysis than I do. I've been on a great learning curve over the last year, co-hosting the QE webinars with Brendan, and learning a lot by just watching how you work and how you present. And I'll actually be reflecting some of that back to you for your own reflection, which is part of the story for today, in fact. Then I'll be talking about why visualizations serve as cognitive artifacts, as tools for thinking, and drilling down into that. And then feeding back to you how QE, especially ENA stories, are currently being told. And talking about some of the signals I'm seeing that the future for QE may be a more participatory kind of discipline. And that has implications for the kinds of visualizations, for the kinds of interactivity that we provide. And I'll also be talking about the fluencies that we might need to have, the skill sets and the dispositions to wield these more participatory visual tools, coming from some of my own previous work. Well, we all love connections, so who am I? Here is this fantastic visualization. LinkedIn Labs released this, around about the early mid to late, and they pulled it, unfortunately. But around 2013, I generated my LinkedIn map, and it color coded the different sub networks in quite an attractive and engaging way. And you could it then left it to you to figure out what the networks meant, and you could add the key in the side there. And you can see me adding the labels there, reflecting my world back in 2013. So let me just expand a little bit on that, on those different tribes that I have been walking through and traveling with. So I started off in psychology, and then I moved into ergonomics and did a master's of ergonomics at UCL, specializing in cognitive ergonomics. So either by design or synchronicity, the conference organizers have chosen two keynotes who both come from human factors and ergonomics. And I don't think that's actually coincidence. I think that's an important signal, which I'll be trying to bring out, building on what Abby talked about in her opening keynote. Then I moved into human-computer interaction, working at York University and sponsored by Xerox Europark down in Cambridge, the satellite lab to Park. And there I was focusing on visual design rationale and cognition, making your thinking visible so that other people can understand how you made design decisions, and the cognitive affordances of different visual notations for doing that. So you can start to see a connection to QE's interest in making thinking visible and more transparent in that sense. Then I worked a lot in hypertext and semantic web, thinking about spatial metaphors for user interfaces, thinking about scholarly hypertexts and new ways of communicating ideas and arguments in non-linear and visual ways. And weaving through all of this was the notion of visualizing dialogue and deliberation and argument, making deliberation visible, and interestingly, again, for this talk today, contestable. So how do we make differences in opinion visible and contestable for stakeholders? Then I moved to the Open University, helped to launch the Knowledge Media Institute there, an advanced R&D lab looking at the future of knowledge and media and lifelong learning. And they're continuing the focus on critical thinking, visual thinking, but also working with synchronous groupware and also a lot with open education and where that movement was going at the time. And moving increasingly into learning analytics and data science and AI in ed. And looking at what role analytics could play in fostering some quite high order competencies that a lot of people are talking about in the context of 21st century learning and so forth. Critical thinking, reflective thinking, teamwork, dispositions to learning, and the ethical dimensions of that. And a central thread running through that was and is the question of how you formalize with integrity. When we're talking about very complex human activity and you're going to try and model that, how do you do that with integrity? And of course, the learning analytics field and QE have formed a close partnership because of our shared interest in learning and our shared skill sets and interests in the role of computation. And of course, we had Dragan last year as one of the keynote speakers, unpacking some of those connections. I read David's book, got very excited both about what he was saying and the way he was saying it as well. Wrote a review of that for the learning analytics community. We had him keynoting at the LAC 18 conference, introducing his ideas. And QE and ENA, of course, have made a very strong entrance into the learning analytics community in tandem with the learning sciences. And so we arrive at QE. And I'm declaring myself a beginner, really, compared to the expertise I see on display here. That both makes me slightly anxious and nervous as a speaker, because this isn't me talking about a field I know inside out, like another field I might be talking to. I still feel very much like a newbie, but then I guess we all do. And what's so great about the QE community that is being developed by David and his lab is the generosity and with their sharing of their knowledge, and the way that they are orchestrating the development of a new community like this. And that's coming through very strongly in the sessions here. This is a great place to learn. This is a great place to find identity and to talk about all the aspects of finding a research trajectory in a field, not just the formal stuff that gets presented for 20 minutes in a paper. So this journey I've been on, I think, has primed me for QE, because my fundamental interest is the work of Doug Engelbart's vision in the 60s, which inspired my whole career. And I talk about that at length in a talk, which I've linked to there, about augmenting human intellect with interactive tools. Engelbart invented personal workstations that responded at the speed of thought, depending on what users were doing with keyboards and mice, which he invented as well on the way. If you've never seen the mother of all demos, you just need to Google that and you'll see some amazing stuff. So this idea that computers can be as tools for thinking, because the displays can update as fast as we can think almost, and communicate to the computer, is a very exciting idea, and has literally revolutionized the computing world. And he was doing this in the 60s when most people were still feeding cards into wardrobe-sized computers. So that's led to a fascination with how software helps make thinking visible, how thinking is shaped by formal and semi-formal interactive representations, and studying very closely what happens when people work with those individually or collectively. So I've been working with a particular tool, in fact, called Compendium for the last 20 years. It's an open source tool. We've been building and supporting a community for a long time. If you look at the Compendium tag on my blog, you'll see a lot of stuff there. So the idea of developing open access tools to build a research community to do R&D is one that excites me, and is another draw card for me to what's going on in the QE community, because those tools have literally, I think, been a massive turbocharge for the building of the community, right? If David just wrote a book and there were some good papers out there with some really great ideas, that's one thing. But when you can get up and running really quickly, then that's completely different and very exciting. And just to give you a glimpse, we created a whole Compendium Institute for Compendium, the user community. We had extended funding for a long time. And here's just a screenshot of one project we did. This is one of our peak projects where we were mapping the ideas of geologists and earth scientists as they explored Mars in a simulation out in the Utah desert, connecting their deliberations using this visual language with the video of the meetings, allowing their support team back on Earth to replay the meeting afterwards and navigate around the meeting depending on who was talking about what. So you can learn all about that. But my point is, I've been involved in that enterprise, and it excites me what I'm seeing in the QE community. Okay, so let's drill down now into what do we talk about when we say visualizations as tools for thinking. Okay, let's start with a really familiar one, except this one won't be so familiar. The London Underground, this was one of the first designs for the tube map. Okay, rather different from what we ended up with. And there's a great link there that explains, how that happened. Now, let's look at the anatomy of this visualization, okay? A visualization has an ontology, which in this sense is simply the language. What can we talk about in the world? In this case, it's type nodes and type connections of a particular sort. There is data that comes in. It's the London Tube, all the tube stations and all the connections. And also, just in case you didn't notice, the River Thames. The Thames is there as a little geographical cue, but don't use this map to plan your walking day in London, okay? Because the notation is a very specific one. We've got a sort of wiring diagram, which comes from the engineer who was used to wiring circuit diagrams, who designed this map. We are constraining orientation of links, horizontal, vertical, and 45 degrees. And that is at the expense of geographical accuracy. And there we have our visualization, except of course, these days, they're digital. So interactivity now comes along, which allows us to get a lot more in and out of the application. We don't have to look at a static visualization. We can filter, navigate, zoom in and out, and you'll notice generate alternate representations there. Do you see the two representations in that app? Yes, we've got the diagram and we've got data to text automated descriptions. Take the Victoria line southbound towards Brixton for 3 minutes, okay? We'll come back to that later on. There is a whole community who study visualizations and trying to understand the cognitive affordances of visualizations. So if we take one book, this talks about the fact that a visualization's meaning is emergent from its interaction with a given viewer. This is a sort of human-centered cognitive science perspective. And a nice quote here, that diagrams in and of themselves do not contain all the information that a viewer needs. Okay, the background knowledge that you bring plays a critical role in whether or not it can be processed satisfactorily. So when we read about all the things you need to know about designing a good visualization, often those things are talking just about graphic design. They're important, but we have to think carefully about who that user is, who is that viewer, that analyst. That's going to turn out to be very important, I think, in this talk. Okay, and Mike Scaife, Yvonne Rogers, in what's become a bit of a classic paper now, How Do Graphical Representations Work? Talk about internal cognition augmented by external cognition. And that works in a number of ways. I can't give you all the details, but this notion of computational offloading, that the representation is reducing cognitive effort because you can read off information, you don't have to infer it, you don't have to maintain it in working memory. It's graphically constraining reasoning. Somebody has decided that you need to see certain things and not other things, and that you're going to want to do certain kinds of tasks and reasoning and not other kinds, okay? And that, if it's done well, is helpful. If it's done badly, then you will get very frustrated with that visualization. And there is this continual interplay between internal cognition, which is normally how we think about cognition, up here in the head, and external interplay. My cognition is now externalized and distributed in one or more representations. And when I talk to that, when I look at that representation or interact with it, it's going to change my thinking, which in turn is going to change what I want to see and seek in the display. So it augments personal working memory with a persistent display tuned to particular tasks, but it also provides a shared language and the ability for shared inferencing, just like any kind of map does that we're all gathered around. This is a walk up and use interface, so users are meant to use it with no training, essentially. We all should be able to agree on what it means and what we can use it for and what we shouldn't use it for. And we can point and plan together, and it gives us common ground, a common language and a common spatial reference point. Okay, so you kind of all knew that anyway, right? But there is a whole field which is trying to formalize exactly how this works. So we come to ENA. And as has been pointed out many times in the conference, QE not equal ENA, but for obvious reasons, ENA is the fullest expression of QE principles at the moment. And it's a compelling proof case because it shows that you can actually translate that into running code that delivers powerful analytics. And I want to focus now, of course, not on the statistics or the modeling, but on the visualizations that it generates, because I think that's been pivotal in helping spread the word about QE and about ENA, because many people can engage with those network diagrams. So when we look at it closely, then we've got a number of features that we all now recognize. Variable size nodes, differently colored and weighted connections. The meaning of the nodes has meaning if researchers interpret them in a particular way. The fact that it's a stable layout means you can compare and subtract networks. You get centroids, you get trajectories of centroids, and as we've been seeing at the conference, even more. This example from Bian Wu's seminar in the webinar series. And so, example from Shrechko's presentation in the webinar, we have the ability to put up a display and then flip it in this very compelling way. Everybody enjoys doing that and showing the differences. And that's part of the great design of the ENA algorithm and the design choices that they made. And then we have directed ENA now, which shows that even when two diagrams apparently look extremely closely similar, once you add directionality in, you can start to see differences in directionality and the weighting and so forth. And the tool is just growing in its expressiveness, in its sensitivity, in its ability to detect interesting phenomena in the world. Now, as I've been hosting these webinars, I've been taking note of additional narrative techniques that are used. And from an HCI perspective, a user-centered design perspective, when you see people working around a tool or augmenting that software, using pen and paper, sketching, or adding input from other tools, these are clues to gaps in cognitive support. And they then raise potential improvements in the software. So here's Goal presenting, and she's decided to foreground and highlight particular interesting feature, and she's put other stuff in the shade. Okay, she's done that in PowerPoint. You can't do that in the tool at the moment. Here's Bian again. He's designed a gallery, and now he's chosen to highlight certain features to draw attention to them. And then we have the fantastic integration of animated ENA synchronized with the source video, like the Law and Order clip. You should go and take a look at that if you haven't seen it. Or in this more recent example from the data challenge that was run, comparing how Jacinda Ardern and Donald Trump talked about COVID. Again, synchronized with the transcript and with the animated ENA. Very compelling, beautiful examples of how to get the message across to a general audience. So just to summarize so far, ENA is serving as an aid to shared external cognition through these processes of computational offloading, graphical constraining, this interplay between internal and external, the fact that we've got a shared visual and focus and a way to point and plan, an accessible shared language, at least amongst us as researchers for joint sense making, and the additional narratives that accompany these diagrams in order to tell the story and direct the viewer's attention. I want to be talking about this in more detail because if we're going to bring in other people, then there are implications for how we scaffold that interpretation. So the first question I want to open up now is, who are we talking to, and do they get to interpret the meaning? So going back to Jim G's opening keynote last year, he unpacked the distinction between the emic world, the world that the stakeholders inhabit, the language they talk, their experienced world, and the fact that as researchers, we come in as a participant observer, if you're an anthropologist, an ethnographer, and move into the etic world, where we take data, we design data, code it, visualize it, and then communicate the findings to our fellow researchers. So we know how to do that, and that's been an extremely important thing for the community. So other researchers will judge our papers against scientific criteria, and establishing the credibility of the field has been absolutely the first focus for us to establish our academic credentials. But if we now want to have QE that validates with stakeholders, we're taking the visualizations and we're feeding them back into the EMIC world. And that's where things start to get more interesting. So Mike Phillips in his webinar talked about this very nicely, where he had ENA diagrams from teachers of maths, science, and IT based on their curriculum design materials, and IT looked very odd. They did not seem to be making the kinds of connections you'd expect to see in a well-designed curriculum. Luckily, Mike took this back to the teachers, and we have this beautiful quote from the webinar. So they were having conversations all the time, the two teachers, but that didn't get translated into the kinds of documentation they had in school. They were doing this on the fly in real time, and so all of a sudden, I realized that just using one of these data sources didn't give me the full picture. So he takes it back to the stakeholders, and they validate what's going on and explain what's going on that's invisible when you just take one data source. Nice example. Here's another great example from Gold's webinar and the work she's doing with Hazel Vega, where they talk about setting the stage to co-create meaning together with the teachers and to ensure that this network is just one interpretation of what they said. Okay, so they are explicitly giving permission to the stakeholders to engage with and, if necessary, challenge the interpretation. And that's what they then saw. So the researcher is annotating this network with a pen as they feed this back to the English as foreign language teachers. And they would say, the teachers would say things like, there's a dotted line here between reflection on accents and rejection, because the teacher said she felt there should have been a link between those two things for her discourse. Okay, and they also talk about that bottom node, the fact that the word tension had meanings, different meanings to the teachers than it did to the analytical mindset of the researchers. Now, we don't have ENA tools that support this kind of informal annotation. We don't do dotted lines. And we can't change these diagrams on the fly. But they're doing it with a pen and paper, which is perfectly appropriate. But I really sat up when I saw this, because it connects to, as you'll see, work that I was doing on how you create participatory visual representations that engage stakeholders. So when we loop the ETIC back into dialogue with the EMIC, the stakeholders are being given a voice to validate the analysis. The ETIC could change the EMIC, and Jim G talked about feeding back ethnographic observation to the stakeholders, and the fact that that could and potentially should change what they do, because it could give them new insights if you're feeding back in the right kinds of ways. But equally, the EMIC could change the ETIC. And that's something that we may want to talk about further, because that's obviously a huge methodological issue as well. Well, what does it mean for the stakeholder to disagree with your analysis? What if you think they're wrong? So there are lots of interesting issues coming back here, and we can talk more about that. But if these are the kinds of conversations we want to have, then it raises some interesting representational issues. So when we are expanding the audience and the visualizations are playing all these different functions on the left, with the addition potentially of more malleability to support the emergence of new meanings, this is only going to work if the representation is firstly intuitive, and if it's malleable or editable in some way, which starts to generate interesting ideas about the affordances of the software. We might choose that not to change the software, and we're just going to work with pen and paper, fine. But maybe there's some value in capturing what goes on in the software as well. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is what I'll call QE inside, with apologies to Intel. Okay, and this is the idea that as the field evolves, QE is going to start to be embedded inside other tools, okay, to support work systems, as Abigail Wooldridge was talking about. Work systems are the unit of analysis for human-centered design of technology. And that means we're going to have to think differently about QE visualizations as well. So now we're designing work systems, right? So we start from the EMIC. This is the work system, the activity that we're studying. We've got the researchers doing their thing, taking data out of the system and feeding it back either in real time or at some periodicity embedded in a tool. Okay, it's not the researchers who are doing all the analysis and visualization and interpretation. That analysis is coming back in a tool that will be used by the stakeholders or possibly other users as well. Users whose activity has not shaped those representations, but they're interested in what this tool has to say as well. So we now have a work system, and it's got a tool, and it's got users as well, additional stakeholders who may not be the same ones as the people who've been studied. Okay, well, this is a new and more interesting kind of system now. There are some implications, right? QE is now no longer just a research methodology to produce papers. QE is now part of what we hope will be a human-centered design process. We are increasing the diversity of voices in the system design. That is going to change the visualization design process because, as we saw earlier, the affordances and the meaning of a representation vary with user expertise, and we are now talking about a diversity of user expertise. That is going to change the product, the tool, because what stakeholders or other users want to see and do is going to be different from the kinds of things that we do as QE researchers. They've got a job to do. This is part of their daily life, perhaps, and QE has to fit into that and their work processes. And this is going to differ from what we want to do. And critically, there is now no QE researcher to stand by the slide or the ENA tool and provide an additional narrative and drive the tool. All of that narrative, all of that interactivity is delivered in the tool, and it has to be usable by the target audience. So we're starting to see this happening. Now, the first example is really still for researchers. This beautiful Game of Thrones demo that was produced and presented at last year's conference by Zach Zwiecki and team, which allows you to explore in a very nice way the ENA diagram connected to the transcript and so forth. It's just a much better user experience than navigating in our ENA or the web ENA tool. It's starting to look more like a polished tool for researchers, and they talk about how they simplified the diagram as well. They've taken out some of the details around SVD and the variance it accounts for, and etc. All right, and they were quite selective in what they chose to put in the tool in order to bring out some of the key messages. They've already designed affordances into this that you would not have in the raw researcher tool. At LAC 18, there was a presentation talking about a teacher dashboard, which for real-time monitoring of what was going on in one of the virtual internship platforms. And if we zoom in on the diagram, okay, you can see there are some changes being made to raw researcher ENA. Okay, first of all, we've got a headline at the top which summarizes the key point. This is the take-home message, a key headline message, and that's a nice data storytelling feature. Data storytelling is the use of good information design to simplify and amplify the key messages in a representation. And we can see that the nodes here are, the node position has no meaning now. It's just laid out for clarity in a nice circle. They have no semantics. In another example here from the Wisconsin lab, there's a high-level dashboard that just gives you a red, amber, green traffic signal about the status of a team. When you drill down, then you get to see the dashboard. And again, the same devices are being used. We've got a headline message about the overall status of the team. It's looking good. The nodes have no meaning except they're laid out for clarity, so we can do the nice comparison of changes between teams. Here's an example from our own work where we're not even using ENA at all, but we're using the QE concepts, the multimodal data matrix that we talked about in our webinar, and there's a paper there in more detail, in order to, again, to highlight key headlines for the user. But ENA is just in the background. Sorry, ENA is not there, but QE concepts and methodology are in the background there. And then in our most recent work, which we'll present in a couple of months at the LAC conference, we were looking specifically at the position of students and teachers around a simulated ward. And those locations are going to become the nodes in the ENA diagram. So we started to use ENA to try and model the different states of the teams. So up comes the standard ENA diagram, which we're all familiar with. And we wanted to validate whether teachers could make sense of this. Well, this was our first baby step to see, could teachers make sense of a representation like this? Well, the answer is yes. Yes, they could read off nodes, links, colors, and thickness after a little briefing from us. They could see that there are differences. They could understand the subtraction network. It made sense to them. It made sense. It validated what they knew about those student teams. So that was good. They started talking about correcting the node names, simplifying them or correcting them. They started talking about merging nodes and splitting nodes. But what caused great confusion was the fact that we are talking about spatial location on the ward, and ENA node position bore no resemblance to spatial location. So we saw quite a lot of confusion. For example, we had to keep reminding them that this did not show them spatial position on the ward. One teacher thought the diagram was upside down because nodes were in the wrong place. Another teacher thought that an edge passing close to a node meant the student passed close to that location. No, it didn't. That we had two nodes that should really have been merged in their view. We had a node about the mannequin patient streaming data. We had a node about the nurse who was role-playing the patient. Of course, conceptually, that's just the patient as far as the teacher is concerned. Those nodes, having them split was confusing. So those are the kinds of differences that were coming out. So again, this notion of QE inside is, okay, we don't necessarily have to render the ENA directly. Let's instead switch to ENA-based annotation of a different visualization that makes more intuitive sense for this work system. And that, of course, is the ward floor plan. Let's make a map of the bed, the zones around it, and we're going to translate the insights from ENA, but into different visualizations. ENA node size becomes color saturation, which is mapped into the plan, so we get a heat map of which spaces were occupied most. ENA edge size and edges are translated directly, but onto the floor plan. So we are literally looking at people and how they move between the zones. And because we had nodes about asking for help and receiving help, those are obviously qualitatively different activities from being in a location. So we just invented different icons for them. Now, this has not yet been validated, but in terms of the cognitive affordances and thinking about cognitive offloading and graphical constraining of reasoning, this representation satisfies those kinds of requirements much better than a generic ENA diagram. Okay, so those are examples of what we're seeing now of QE being inside other applications that have a broader audience and who are going to be talking about their work system and their world. But I want to talk now about the fact that we can go beyond networks, okay? We can have interactively linked complementary representations. Most visualization tools that if you've used any like Power BI, Tableau, etc., you click on one view and all the other views filter accordingly. And that's a very powerful way of exploring the data. But we don't even have to be thinking about just visualizations. Although let's start with one that we all know and love, right? Underpinning the network diagram is a matrix. But if you had a lot of nodes in the matrix in the diagram, that starts to get cluttered, edges are occluding, nodes are occluding each other. It may be that simply transforming that matrix into a heat map shows us some patterns and signals that are helpful to see in that view and are different from what you see in a network diagram. And maybe these can be coupled. Let's think about data to text as well, though. Remember, I showed you that Tube app for navigating the underground, and it's generating natural language summaries for the reader. So here we have Sylvia and GJ in their webinar, and they're talking about their ENA diagrams. And we have a classic piece of commentary from Sylvie, right? We can compare males and females, and looking at those two networks, we can see that vitalism is very much a female thing. Now, that is almost exactly what she said, but it's not hard to imagine the tool generating that summary. I just cleaned up her speech a little bit because it had all the usual human things that we do when we talk. Here we have it again. And we can see that in contrast, males emphasize the connection between ecological factors and nutritional factors. Okay, again, why couldn't the tool generate that summary? Here's Shrechko. The results show significant differences between teachers when acting as agents than compared to acting as role implementers. And again, here's another example. So I'm just trying to stretch our thinking here. Why could a future version of the tool not be generating a summary which is extremely accessible to a non-expert, as well as potentially being really useful for researchers as well? Because this is what we do when we present, but embedded in a tool or with you not present, we can amplify that narrative story using a complementary representation that everybody can understand. So in a future ENA tool, it's not that we have to choose prose or text, prose or networks or heat maps or anything else we invent. We can offer them all, we can make them configurable, and we can link them interactively. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about then is if we have this trend towards more participatory QE, because we want to engage our stakeholders to validate our analysis and give them a voice, and we are seeing this trend towards QE inside or powered by ENA, and we want to see that as a human-centered design, part of a human-centered design process. I'm going to put it to you that this requires a new skill set on our behalf as well. It requires a fluency in using QE visualizations for participatory sense making. And I'm going to introduce you very briefly to the knowledge art framework that came out of the doctoral work of Al Selvin several years ago and has been developed since in different ways. So we're coming back to these examples here. You know, we had Mike Phillips' example, the example from Gol and Hazel. And let's imagine the kinds of conversations that could be going on if we think this through a little further. Should we be encouraging the following kinds of conversations, and should our tools be supporting it? Imagine you are coming into a meeting with your stakeholders. Do we want them to be saying things like, well, that node name isn't quite right. We'd normally refer to it like this. That's exactly what our teachers were saying to us when we fed back the visualizations of the nurses' positions in the simulation ward. Why isn't there a link there? Can I just add that now? These two nodes, they're really the same thing. Let's just merge them, and then we'll be able to see much more clearly what's going on. Could the tool do that? Could it update automatically by deciding to merge two nodes? This node's confusing two things. We need to split that up. Now we can discuss their different links much more clearly. And we had exactly that problem, that comment in our study, that a node was really embodying two different things and needed splitting up. Let's make that green link much thicker so we can see the contrast with red more clearly. Okay, these are the kinds of things that stakeholders in the EMIC world might be feeding back to us because they're trying to make sense of this network. They're trying to come up with plausible narratives. So the knowledge art framework is talking about the facilitation skill set of crafting participatory visual representations to facilitate joint sense making. And we have this diagram that shows the framework. So there's the practitioner with the visualization and participants. And up here are all the usual kinds of things you find in a typical work context, right? The software, the technology, the methods and data that they use as part of their lived world. What we're focusing on are these particular 5 competencies that practitioners need to have according to our analysis. And I'm going to unpack those for you now. You are making aesthetic decisions, choices about how you shape the visualization, What's being foregrounded, backgrounded, and excluded? How polished it is, how rough it is, how editable it is. We are making ethical decisions. There is an ethical dimension to this. What we do in conducting and facilitating these meetings changes the conversation. We can recognize and reflect what people are saying in the visualization, or we can ignore their contribution because the visualization can't handle it, for example. We might shift topic because the visualization's got something very interesting that you'd like to talk about, and you want to draw their attention to it. But that's distracting or taking attention away from something else they might be talking about. And we've only got an hour and a half. It's ethical. There is a narrative. There's the narrative for what this visualization might mean, but it's also the narrative of why we're here, spoken and unspoken expectations about what we should be doing, what kinds of outputs are we going to produce, what's going to be done with those outputs. There is sense making. You may run into a roadblock in the meeting and you've got to make sense of what that means. And then you need a repertoire of improvisation, what you're going to do as a result in order to keep the conversation moving forward and service the participants. So what if we put E&A into that visualization? What would the conversation look like? So here's how it plays out, okay? Some sketches for you just to give you an idea. Aesthetics, right? I've talked about the fact that raw viz out of the researcher version is being simplified already. We're seeing that happening to make it more accessible. If you walk into a meeting with an impregnable, opaque representation, you know, we're already off to a bad start aesthetically. Is it fixed or malleable? Does it open up more productive conversations? What can be changed in the visualization? The ethical dimensions. Does this visualization empower or disempower stakeholders? Are we amplifying or muffling their voices with the representation? If the visualization tool can't reflect what somebody's saying, what are we saying to them? What is the message that that gives? When a researcher changes the topic in order to focus on an unexplored part of the viz, you know, that can be important because you really want to talk about the fact that there doesn't seem to be much of a link between two things and you want to get the stakeholders' views on that. But you are changing the conversation. The visualization can drive conversation, and that can be good or bad. The narrative. You know, what are the power dynamics and trust levels in the meeting around this visualization? You're in a powerful position as a researcher. You invented this visualization. You're now feeding it back to the stakeholders. Are we here simply to validate our story, or are we here to elicit new stories? What are the stakes? You know, what's going to happen to this analysis? If we're talking to people in a context of a work system, are they worrying that what you're going to say to the decision makers is going to change their workplace? Because your analysis of their work says the following, okay? The stakes are different now than when you're just writing a paper, and the stakeholders are never going to read that. How do you make sense when somebody says, this isn't the right E&A? I need to see an A for those teams, and I'd like to hide those dimensions, and let's change the link weights to make everything more visible. How fast can you do that? Because that's the kind of situation I was facing when I was using Compendium. People would say, that's not the map we need to see. We need to see that map from 3 meetings ago, and I want to see when we talked about X. And I had to be extremely fluent with my tool to bring up that display to keep the conversation going forward. So I can see similar situations with E&A. How do we handle the surprise and discontinuities that might happen? You think they're going to make sense of this. They think it means something different. How do we work with that? We know from cognitive science that sketching and tinkering and messing around with informal, incomplete representations is extremely important for sharpening up emerging thoughts and ideas, right? I'm sure you all have your own versions of that. So again, that has software implications, or it has implications for any other representational tools that we're using. And finally, improvisation. How do we make these spontaneous, unplanned moves with the visualizations? We know from studies of improvisation that experts have a repertoire. they're doing disciplined improvisation, whereby they combine creative, ad hoc, spontaneous actions with predefined tools, methods, templates, whatever it is that their methodologies provide. So we can ask now, what is the improvisational repertoire for working with these kinds of emergent QE representations? And what's the learning curve? And can we train people to do this? Perhaps we should be running a workshop on this in the next conference, if we can figure out what that looks like. So there's a lot more you can learn about knowledge art. You can watch Al presenting this work. A book came out of his PhD, and I've been teaching this to our data science master's students, and you can access that as an open educational resource. So let me wrap up. I'm privileged to give you a sneak preview of the 2022 program. If any of these ideas make sense and you decide to pick them up and run with them, maybe we'll be seeing papers like the following. Is a picture worth 1,000 words? Teachers' preferences for ENA generated prose versus networks. QE Viz 2.0. Great, there's a new tool out. Video plus linked interactive QE visualizations. Sorry, but that's not how we do things. The politics of adapting QE visualizations in response to stakeholder feedback. Or integrating QE analytics into an ER nursing handover support tool. Acknowledgements to Abby Wooldridge there. Design challenges and empirical evaluation. So these are potentially research trajectories that this kind of agenda might open up. So my closing slide then, well, but one. I hope I haven't given you indigestion with these dishes. I hope that they'll go well, perhaps with one that you brought or are considering cooking in the coming year. I've talked about how we are feeding back to our stakeholders. I've talked about linked multiple complementary visualizations. I've talked about QE inside, embedded tools inside new work systems that we are now going to be supporting. And I've talked about the skill set that might be required if we're going to start wielding participatory QE visualizations with fluency. Thank you very much, and I really look forward to your comments in the remaining time and in the chat session that follows.
Well, thanks very much, Simon. In a normal situation, you would get a big clap from all of us, but hopefully in this kind of at least virtual clap also will be at least something that we can offer to you. We have, I think, a fair bit of time now to engage into conversation with Simon. Simon, perhaps at this stage it makes sense to stop sharing the slides, but you did already. Perfect, so thanks much. So anyways, anybody wants to break ice and start asking some questions or reacting to some of the points that Simon made? I think the presentation was really, really inspiring. Many really excellent points. Some of these, some that really well also align with me is basically kind of going back to the people we are observing and the groups we are observing, and basically using the kind of language that they are using in terms of emics, rather than basically expecting that they will be actually using our more kind of ethic type of a language. It's really something that's really resonating with my thinking about the process and everything that you've been speaking about, and obviously many excellent points and the challenges. Anyways, anybody wants to start first? I can hear lots of people being excited, lots of people being inspired. Anybody? Okay, Barbara.
Just put my hand down for a second. Yeah, thank you for a very inspiring and interesting talk, Simon. I was thinking because in ENA, that what's underlying these diagrams that we're seeing is the researcher's interpretation of the data or the networks or whatever. We do our own coding based on things that we see as important. And maybe it's those, in some way, sometimes those codes that are different than maybe what the people we've been looking at would be seeing. So I guess in the case when you're looking at your surgeries, you've worked on that discipline enough that you sort of know the key things that are important: movement around the room, places in the room, how things move. So maybe your codes are good enough that you could then discuss them with somebody. But when we're starting working with a new field, I think it's the hardest part is, at least my experience, and I am by far no expert at all, it's identifying these good points that we're going to end up in our visualizations with. I don't know if you think about that at all, if that.
Well, so what I'm hearing, Barbara, is the fundamental point that there is no absolute truth out there when it comes to studying human activity, right? We are coming up with, as in any complex system, you know, in the world of sense making, we talk about constructing plausible narratives, right? It's so complex that there is no you know, definitive account of what happened. It's always an account for a purpose from a perspective. Okay, I think we can all accept that. You know, that's an epistemological commitment that this is a plausible narrative, right? As scientists, as trying to get our work published out there, we are constructing plausible narratives that will pass the standards of our peers in order to establish a respectable field. But plausible narrative has to make sense to the stakeholders too. Well, this is the debate, right? And there may be people in the room who know more about the field of how anthropologists and ethnographers talk about feeding back to the work system they've been studying, right? And what you do with that. And I'm sure we can learn more from that. And I don't have that background, and I'm just dying to get time to read some stuff about how ethnographers talk about feeding back to the people they've been hanging out with for the last 3 months or year, right? And what happens in those conversations, right? So the codes are constructions. They serve our purpose because we as researchers want to provide an account of something. We want, you know, but we have an agenda as researchers. We want to show, for example, that compared to our gold standard analysis done by humans and validated using Rho, coding and counting doesn't catch important things, but ENA does, right? That's our agenda, is to validate this exciting new methodology. But if our agenda, as Abby Wooldridge was talking about, is to improve the working conditions of people and give them powerful new tools for thinking, then our research agenda is not the only story in play here. And as Mike and Gol and Hazel and showed, taking your analysis back to the stakeholders isn't just about being nice and showing them what you've been up to. This is about actually improving your analysis, because they're the domain experts, right? So this is arguably part of what we should be doing as a field, but it raises lots of interesting issues around methodology, about whose voice counts more than another's, and as I've been emphasizing in today's talk, about our representational suite of tools and how we wield them. Because as you say, codes are constructions and there is no one truth. It's all up for negotiation.
Great, thanks, Simon. Further questions? While the audience is making up their minds, and some of them are asking questions, so I'll check the chat. Simon, I want to ask you one thing, that given that you raised this point of ethics, and I do the very importance of ethics, is as often we observe also lots of bias in data, and also through the type of observations you might be doing in quantitative ethnography as well. The question is the extent to which you see the importance of this management of the types of visual presentations of our results, and how we can then tackle the presentation of bias identified in the data as well as the phenomenon we are studying.
Interesting. Well, so we're not really talking about bias in the sense of, machine learning bias, biased data sets, and that kind of thing. We're talking more about controlling for researcher bias, because it might conflict, their interpretations might conflict with the stakeholders' perspectives. So that's one form of bias management. When I was in the advanced RE&A workshop a couple of days ago, I was intrigued, and I put a screenshot up from that session on Twitter about the fact that you can, RE&A gives you a control for how heavy or thick do you want those edges to be when you display the E&A diagram. There's a multiplier that you can add so that faint lines become thicker or more visible, right? Everything just gets more visible or gets faded into the background, depending on where you set your thresholds. So that's just a classic example of how the formal representation could completely change, depending on the setting you make, you could completely change the conversation that happens, depending on whether something's visible or not. Either, at one setting, there's no connection at all between two nodes. At another setting, there's a faint connection. Now, that has an affordance for reasoning and discussion. And it requires expertise with the tool to know to what extent that's true, or whether it's just a relative, to explain to the stakeholder, that's just relative. And it's that coupling between the deep understanding of your technical tools and the way that this scientific instrument functions, and how that shapes what becomes visible to different stakeholders. So that was just an example that I picked up, and I'm by no means expert with these tools compared to everybody else here. And you may have other great examples that you could give of that. Right. So I'm not saying we shouldn't have that setting at all, but that's a way of talking about how you bias the conversation and the sense making simply by that parameter on its own. Brendan, you've got a question.
Yeah, great talk. Thank you for a lot to think about. And I really appreciate how you highlighted different aspects of how people are doing this from the webinars and other aspects of what people have been sharing of their work. One of the things that just came to mind based on what you were talking about was some work that Peter Levine had done, where he worked with people making concept maps on the fly, where they would, part of the discourse was, well, why did you put this here? What should this look like? And they would basically continue to evolve the concept map together and do kind of a think aloud through that. And one of the things that we kind of talked about was, how would you integrate something like that within E&A? Some things would be pretty easy, right? Like combining a code would be a pretty simple thing to do. You could just add, binary sum the columns of that code, and you could go from there. Splitting codes would be a little bit more challenging, but I love the idea of bringing that type of engagement into how we make meaning with these tools. And I thought it was really thought-provoking, and I also think you did a great job highlighting that from what we're already seeing. And so just thank you so much. And I just wanted to throw that out there. I think these are great suggestions.
Thanks, Brendan. Yeah, so that's exactly the kind of thing that I had in mind, that there are already tools to assist domain experts to make their conception of their domain and their practice visible, right? But so maybe part of the future is that we're coming sort of bottom up from the EMIC. If the EMIC is on the ground, okay, that's the lived world, and there are tools to make visible and allow non-QE experts to make their understanding of their world visible. That's an emergent, rough, provisional representation, and it's accompanied by a lot of talk, and that talk is extremely important to capture, because these representations are incomplete. When somebody draws a line between two things, like on a whiteboard, what they're doing and the context of that line that's extremely important to capture, right? But we know how to do that. That gives us their worldview, That's an important worldview. It's not the only worldview that counts, though, because, of course, as researchers, we gain insights into the world that the people living in that world do not have. That's why we do research. So our view counts too. The question is how they come together, how each can shape the other. And that, to me, is a fascinating dance. The etic and the emic dance with different representations, hopefully coming together to produce a representation which is a more plausible narrative than we would have had with just the one or the other. I'm seeing a lot of hands up here. Shall I just go to people?
Yes, please.
All right. Daniel, you popped up first on my screen.
Just to be fair, I think Jamie popped up first.
Oops.
I'm happy to go second after Jamie.
Jamie.
No, go ahead. I'm still sort of percolating that thought. Go ahead.
All right.
Okay, sure. I was kind of thinking, I mean, thanks for an awesome and thoughtful presentation. But I mean, it's always risky when, you know, in a sense, when we put designers sort of in between this process, because of course, you know, it's quite challenging to do participatory sense making, even with the knowledge art framework, you know, and then suddenly, you know, the insights, you know, that designers might take as non-experts from the experts sort of begin to kind of water down and create another set of codes that, you know, make it even more difficult for, you know, this different stakeholders to see. I mean, I think, you know, you're well aware of the challenge of visualizing learning analytics and making sense of those. I mean, I think it's the same challenge here in terms of, you know, how do we create sort of a common language that, you know, stakeholders can understand, that satisfies some of the insights that the researchers have, and, you know, from a design point of view, because a lot of times designers are sort of jacks of all trades, you know, and they don't bother to go into the sort of, you know, understanding part. You know, they stick on the surface of the eye candy.
Right.
And so I guess there's a real risk, I think, from my own experience as a designer, but also, you know, in the last kind of decade working with designers trying to visualize things, you know, it's been a very unsatisfactory kind of experience.
Okay, well, that comes down to your designers and the quality of the conversations that happen between the researchers and the designers and their understanding of their target audience. You know, a good designer is a godsend, right? I mean, we cannot communicate our stuff as researchers without really good design, in my view, especially when we're designing interactive tools, right? I mean, researchers are lousy at designing good user experiences because they want the power tool, you know, and they don't know how to design in a user-centered way. But what we've already seen, I think, is some impressive design capability within the community to put out tools. But you know, the Game of Thrones example is a nice one. The animated visualizations with video is cool. RE&A is obviously a researcher's tool, and gives you all the bells and whistles and power that you want, but you don't want to expose that to everybody. So it's all about designing for purpose and for context. And you know, I'm excited at where this can go. So yeah, bad designer just gets in the way. Good designers are absolute dream to have on team.
Yeah, but I think it's more of how do we onboard those good designers now, right? Because the examples you showed sort of make the sort of bedrock of, you know, foundation for a good designer to work from. You know, instead of a designer then saying, this is great, I'm really happy to be on your team, Simon. Can you give me the one paper that describes, you know, like, you know, ENA, and then I'll make an awesome design. I mean, you know, just to sort of,
Sure.
you know,
okay. Well,
take
I think
a
that's
bad design example.
Yeah. Well, let's not recruit those. You know, that's not how good design happens. You know, give me the spec and I'll go code it and I'll be back in 2 weeks with the first. Right? It's got to be a conversation. Yeah. Okay, shall we jump to Jamie now?
Thanks.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. So I was thinking about this from an anthropological lens. I'm not an anthropologist, and I would love to hear Sylvie's take on this, but there is the element of human-centered design, I think, is a really important piece in quantitative ethnography. And there are previous tools that have been developed to look at incorporating preservation of a participant's voice in the research design and the interpretation of the findings in mapping these cognitive thoughts and utterances of speech. But I almost wonder, you know, I don't think it's as linear as we think it is, in the sense that it depends on the experience in the context of your research itself and the solutions that you're trying to address, or the problems that you're trying to address. And you know, I've seen other tools out there that use the tool specifically as a form of communication, to kind of dance around how to go from that emic to etic, those areas. But I think in terms of human connection, you need to have those explicit conversations where those spontaneous ideas come into play. And I think that this is messy, or it's supposed to be messy by design, and because otherwise you can't really get at those phenomena of interest. So
Oh,
I don't know.
totally agree. Yeah. So just to clarify, you know, the whole knowledge art framework is all about how you handle that messiness and complexity, because there's so much happening, and you as a practitioner can feel under extreme pressure, especially if you're the one wielding the tool. Software and big displays and you know, there are many ways that facilitators try and empower the participants to put the pen in their hands, put the keyboard in their hands as well. And we can, that's just all part of, you know, collaboration and collective sense making research and design. The point about there not being a researcher there to engage with the stakeholders comes in when we have embedded QE analytics inside some other tool that is being used in a work system. And that's where the narrative affordances of the tool have to be that much better, because there is nobody to explain. That's why we see the representations getting simpler, and the addition of, you know, of other techniques that I've talked about could help, such as generating prose summaries, allowing linked representations to add, to fill in some of the gaps, etc. Yeah. So take your point totally. It's messy, but it's disciplined messiness. It can be disciplined messiness. It can be disciplined improvisation.
Ordered chaos.
Ordered chaos. You know, this is very different from walking into a room with a blank easel chart or whiteboard and saying, let's do stickies, right? I mean, we've got a language to talk about. We've got representations we can bring in to help structure things. Okay, who's next? I can see Eric's hand up on my screen. Should we go to Eric?
Sure, Simon, thank you very much. And what an interesting and compelling discussion. I think if others are like me, their minds started racing as soon as you started opening up some of the ideas and vision. I agree with Daniel's comments about the messiness of designers as mediators, but I keep coming back to, and have always felt this itch or concern about the ENA models, in that they document the existence of, intensity of, and variations of relationships, but the models themselves don't and cannot articulate what the relationship is, simply the nature of its existence. It doesn't give a semantic structure to the relationships. And what I see provoked from the ideas that you're sharing with this community is the opportunity. Of course, the researcher is always imposing an interpretation on the edge between two nodes and trying to make sense of it. But this is really a large step forward. I don't know what the design factors will look like. You've mentioned many of them that I'm sure will be operationalized or become reality, but having opportunities for different stakeholders to annotate, comment on, lend their own insight, I think is going to be a large step forward for research communities more generally, but one that this community would be especially ready for. So I guess my comment is more maybe sharing the excitement that a lot of people are expressing in the chat window about the idea of a participatory interpretation functionality that doesn't currently exist, but that this community could especially use in given the fact that a whole new world of documenting the types of relationships is made possible by these tools. But as you say, there's in the world of human interactions, there are so many different interpretations. This opens the door for giving voice to many others, and it's exciting to see. So I guess there's no question in that. I'll affirm what Daniel said, that there's a lot of complications with designers mediating, giving those interpretations, but it's very exciting.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric. I appreciate that. Just listening to you, it sort of sparked another thought. Sorry, software designers are always wary of researchers because they go, "Oh, I've just had another idea," and the designers are going, "No." But when we've got those good designers and good developers on team, then they love this, and that's my experience, because they are pushing the edges, right? So imagine we're in a meeting and we've got the stakeholders talking about a particular link between two nodes, or between 3 nodes, right? I want to be able to click on those links, right? Click, 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 because we're talking about a particular configuration of important relationships that the stakeholder is talking about. We are now recording what they're talking about why those relationships are so important, okay? We can now replay that later on as a research team when we're going back over it, and we've got an index into the interview through the ENA diagram, for example. So it's not just a temporal transcript. We can now navigate around the diagram depending on who was talking about what. Or we take 2 nodes and we merge them, and smart stuff happens in the background. The edges all update, and now a conversation starts to take a different direction. So these are the kinds of things in my mind. As my old boss, Mark Eisenstadt at the Open University used to say, just a small matter of coding.
Yeah, I don't know, Simon, if I can, I'm not tracking all the way with documenting every step of a dialogue, because there's just not that much time in a human's life to do that. But maybe you're right, and in any case, the realm of the possible, so long as it's just a matter of coding, is unlimited.
Well, actually, there's some really interesting methodological issues, I think, that people will want to start talking about, right? What does it mean when they do that? And hang on, there's a whole integrity to the whole process of producing these representations, and we can't just have lay people messing around with them like that. So a whole bunch of really interesting conversations to have.
Can't have that
around that. Okay, Morten, I see your hand up.
Yes, very interesting presentation, and brings a lot of thoughts to my mind, and especially the social aspect. Very interesting. But I have a very simple question, and a very maybe a stupid question. I don't really know, but I dare to ask. Right. So the ENA model is basically a network model, right? This is the key representation that we are working with, and you laid that out very nicely, and the affordances of such a model. But have you thought about, will there be like any? Of course, this has limitations. There are some constraints. It focuses on relations rather than magnitudes, and so is there? My worry is that there could be some kind of growing bias if we mainly look at network model, or only look at network models. Have you any thoughts about this, and what have you been? I would think that you have thought about this when prepping for this presentation.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the heart of the question, right? It has certain affordances, which are being chosen, for very good reason, obviously, because we are interested in the relationships between things. That's when we understand their meaning in a new way than simply the fact that they happened or coincided together. Network diagrams are graphically constraining. As I was trying to emphasize, they are designed to support certain kinds of reasoning, and they prevent other kinds of reasoning. Now, it's up to the community to decide whether there are some other important kinds of reasoning that we engage in, either amongst ourselves as researchers, or that we will need to engage in as we open up the conversation to others. That network diagrams, they're not the silver bullet. And at the moment, anybody coming to a QE conference for the first time or reading the proceedings is going to go, this is the ENA network community, right? I mean, these guys do network stuff. I mean, it's very interesting network stuff, but it's basically networks. So you're absolutely right. And I know the Wisconsin team do not want ENA to be seen as QE, right? It just happens to be that's what's visible. And so that's why I'm trying to stretch our thinking here by talking about other ways of generating interesting views. They're just views. They're partial views onto the underlying data. There are other views that have other affordances, and together they can complement each other. So yeah, it's a risk. It's a risk, just like any field that overuses one instrument to study the phenomenon and is blindsided to other interesting things that are going on. So I totally agree. It's just that we haven't come up with many other good representations yet. What we have come up with are an increasingly interesting set of scaffolding around the representation. I'm seeing Amanda's note there in the chat. We've got people like Cesar who brings design sensibility to help people engage with these representations in more make them more accessible. But it's still network centric. So part of this talk is about saying, what would it mean to break out of that box? Now, if the community concludes that we don't need to see anything else, well, fine. We don't need them.
I don't. For instance, your way of going from network to text as like walking the network, or I mean, there are many possibilities there. So it's well, I just wanted to hear your reflection on that question. So.
Oh yeah.
Right. Can I had a bit of back channeling. I'm seeing Cesar is basically being called on, and I had a bit of back channeling, and I think it would be really useful maybe to hear just from Cesar as well, how he got onboarded into the design of these tools, how he basically got, not that I want to put you on the spot, Cesar, so if you feel uncomfortable to take a stand, don't worry. But I think many people in the room would also like to hear from you as well, how you basically got onboarded into this whole process and how you actually tackle with some of the challenges that Simon mentioned in his keynote.
Hi. Well, first of all, this was great. Thank you, Simon, for showing all our wonderful stuff that we make. It's awesome to be a part of this community. I actually knew Brendan from before. We used to work together at a nonprofit. So as soon as you guys, like our lab needed a designer, he contacted me. And I've always wanted to work at a place where I feel like I'm making a difference. And epistemic analytics has provided me that. It's also a place where I feel like I'm not working for somebody that I don't know. It's been a good experience for me to be kind of feeling like I'm building something as a part of a team. And I think that helps a lot when it comes to designing. Like I know the goals that we're trying to make. I know that, things change, but it's all like, I know that it's for the better. And because we try to have good communication, that also helps the design. overall at the end.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
And it has made it.
Could I just throw something out here too? I think one of the things that Cesar and I talk about sometimes pre these conferences is I think it can be awkward for him to figure out where to plug into some of these things, right? Like he can go to these results, but or go to a talk or see different aspects of like his work get realized in a certain way. But I think what kind of centralizes this is, and this is something Cesar has always taught me, is how professional and accessible good design can make things. Is when we're designing things as researchers or using R, it can really be barriers to telling the stories. And I think that the care and attention that he provides, and also the leadership that he provides in our group to clarify things. Like back in our last job, people used to give him hugs or like spontaneously like break out in celebration when they would meet him, whenever he would like touch their work and go from there. But I think similarly, like I kind of knew when he was going to join our group, what would happen when he brought his magic to it. And that's not always true for all designers. But I think that the culture of bringing that in and the importance of all the stuff that Simon was touching on, the importance of having that, we can see what can happen in terms of the accessibility. Yes, there has to be the speed and all these other things, but there's an incredible aesthetic that he brings and sense and commitment to understanding what the goals are. And I'm just kind of inspired to try to figure out how to articulate some of those bits of magic so that it could be replicated, because I just think he does great work and is an incredible leader. So more Cesar chance. I think that was great.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Simon, there was also one point as well I back-channeled with David that we were and thinking about this process, and I really appreciate many points you made here. The question is basically, many of the comments you indicate as well I'd say are generally applicable to learning analytics visualization. So I'd argue even probably more generally to most of data analytics visualizations, wherever you had the human in the loop almost. The question becomes is what is unique in this process for quantitative ethnography in a way that, what is quantitative ethnography is changing in the process as a discipline that kind of is having this ethnographic part, and as a discipline that always has this and tries to have this kind of unique, if you wish, or unifying representation between then that ethnographic or qualitative part and the quantitative part. And so are there any kind of more specific, unique challenges for quantitative ethnography in the process?
Interesting question. So I think we talked about it right in the very first question is part of it from Barbara, the fact that we are talking about human activity, which is extremely complex, and there is no sort of single gold standard account of what happened. So that's important because it means that the representations need to support multiple plausible narratives. In other domains, there are not multiple plausible narratives always. It's much more straightforward. So that will be one answer. The fact that we're so interested in connections and relationships, I think that is interesting because that's something that everybody can talk about. I think that normal people, in other words, people not like us, normal people can talk about how things go together. It is a language. The language of connection is one that is a human thing, I think, without getting too kind of hippie about it. And we can make these representations more intuitive, as I tried to hint today. But I don't think I have a great answer to that so far, other than the fact that all the ingredients seem to be here to do a great job on this front because of the kinds of people we've got, the kinds of network that's growing, and the skill sets in the team. And if we can duplicate Cesar, 10 times all over the world, just imagine what we would be seeing coming out from the different groups who are now taking root. So yeah, this is something that we can unpack further for sure. But the fact that we have a community here who is human-centered, fundamentally human-centered, because we are interested in human activity and providing accounts with integrity and using computational firepower with integrity, that seems to be an important sort of petri dish to start growing some of this stuff. And you would not find that in some other communities, I suspect.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Simon, for the exciting talk, for many great points and reflections. I think we need to close the session.
I am
we are
seeing
already a
one.
couple
I've
of
got. I can see our other keynote with her hand up. Can we take one last question from Abigail?
Yeah, I'm happy as long as the people are happy to stay. Yeah, sure. Abigail, please.
This is really quick, Simon. I just want to say I really appreciated your talk. I think all that you proposed is super, and I didn't even get to come for the first like 30 minutes, so I apologize, but super exciting. I just want to point out what I was saying yesterday or Monday about partnering with our other disciplines and branching out. I think actually has a lot of overlap here. So when we're talking about designing visualizations that are easy to understand and easy for people to use, whether or not they're scientists, maybe they're the participants who are, actually taking a more active role as participants, that involves human factors considerations. So thank you, Simon, for articulating something I was struggling to articulate on Monday. It's really exciting.
Great, thanks. I was able to build off your work very nicely. Thank you. All right. Thanks, everybody. I really look forward to the conversation as this unfolds.
Yeah, thanks so much, Simon, for your excellent talk. We really appreciate all your contributions, and thanks everybody for the excellent discussions with Simon. Yeah, thanks and enjoy the rest of the conference.